Raise some
Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. In the heartland where the faith runs strong, we've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless day and night, we'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call, watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change, time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.
Welcome, folks, to the Raising Cain show. As you can see, I've kind of decorated a little bit more, and I am looking forward to tonight's guest. We are joined by one of America's most prolific voices in modern nonfiction, David Fisher. But before we get into our conversation, I'm going to go ahead and cut to our commercial breaks, get that out of the way so we don't have any interruptions during our talk. But it's going to be a great night. So I want to thank everybody for joining, and we will be right back after this commercial break.
It says, I woke up this morning and looked out the door to a country I don't recognize. They put masks on our face to hide our pain, and there's no fire in most people's eyes. And it's still true today. It's still true today that they've tried to destroy the American spirit. And in some instances, they've done a dadgum good job. But in other instances, they have lit an inferno in some people. And we right now are gathering some of those people that are on freaking fire to save this country.
Increasing expenses have caused us all a lot of pressure these days, and it's affecting even the wealthiest of people. Most have lost their sense of security, stability, and even hope for a strong financial future. The game plan of everyone in your cell phone has likely been disrupted or even hardcore stopped, and most are looking for a creative solution to regain financial momentum. Oftentimes, life's best solutions are the simplest. But first, a question. What is something most people think they should own but don't? Crypto, fine art, real estate? Nope. We are talking about real money. The kind kings and queens fought for and large institutions today buy in mass. We're talking about gold and silver, assets that provide confidence in tough financial situations. So the question is, do you own any? If you don't, you're not alone. Most people aren't maximizing the power of precious metals because it's just been too complicated. And even though they see advertisements about gold and silver daily, they don't really know who to trust. That is, until now. The bottom line is that buying gold and silver doesn't have to be complicated or scary. There's a simple, better way to accumulate assets and create financial peace, headache-free. And this very minute, a new community of average people are seeing above average results to the tune of tens of millions in assets over the last few years. This system is tested, it's simple, and it's not an experiment. To date, it's helped more than 80,000 people bring hope back into their lives. It's invitation only, and right now, this new community has accepted a challenge to give away as much free gold this year as possible. Curious? Learn how to get your free gold today. Check out the next step to get the details.
Since 2017, 150,000 farms have shut down. Working farmland has been reduced by 21 million acres. The system has been crippling the remaining farmers, forcing some to adopt nefarious farming techniques, like pumping hormones and other performance-enhancing drugs into their cows so they can survive in crammed feedlots. Or the farmers are forced to jump ship and sell to land-hoarding, profit-chasing agricultural oligarchies, who use their billions of dollars to crush the competition and increase your family's dependence on their manufactured food. What could possibly go wrong? The family farm will soon be a thing of the past, unless you do something. You can. That's why there's From the Farm, an industry-disrupting platform that connects consumers directly with local farmers, which means you can buy fresh, non-factory farm food, and you'll know exactly where your food came from and how it was raised. For the first time in nearly 100 years, independent farms will have a way to not only survive, but thrive. From the Farm was founded by A.J. Richards, an active homesteader, and Brooke Entz, a CrossFit Games athlete and an Amazonian warrior in the movies Wonder Woman and Justice League. She clearly has a passion for healthy food and a healthy lifestyle. And since both AJ and Brooke come from generations of ranchers and farmers, they know what they're talking about. We can't do this alone. We need the strength of the American people behind us. Help us build a new food system that combines the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future. Investing in From the Farm isn't just a financial decision. It's an investment into our future, our small family farms, and our food sovereignty. Invest today.
Welcome back to the Raising Cain Show. Again, we are joined by one of the most prolific voices in modern American nonfiction, David Fisher. With over 24 bestsellers to his name, David has written everything from military memoirs to gripping historical narratives. In this episode, we dive deep into the sailing of the Intrepid, explore what drove him to pursue writing, and uncover the moments that shaped a remarkable literary career. If you've ever wondered what it takes to turn passion into pages, this is a conversation for you. David, welcome to the show.
Well, Nate, thank you for having me, and welcome to your audience. I'm pleased to be here.
So, David, I guess a good question to ask folks. I mean, you've written several books. What got you into writing, and I mean, what was it that inspired you to become a writer to begin with?
It's a tough question, because there's no easy answer. The only two things I ever wanted to do was write and play shortstop for the Yankees. And when it became clear that that was not going to happen, that left writing. And I think when I was very young, there was a TV show called The Big Story. And The Big Story was about a great newspaper. Each week it was a different newspaper story. And I just have the feeling that might have gotten me hooked. And also my parents subscribed to all the magazines, Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, Collier's. And up in our unfinished attic, we had a big pile of these magazines. And I would go up there and I would kind of lie on that pile and open the magazines. And I can still remember the smell of, that wonderful smell of Life and Look. And so I think that's probably what got me going.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like those experiences that we have when we're young, they stick with us. And, there's something that nostalgia of it, I think it does. It has an impression on us. I think back to a lot of the things that still impact me today. And it is a lot of the things that I experienced as a young kid. My sense of adventure comes from growing up in a world where, we did there was a lot more freedom. Like I wouldn't have allowed my kids to have as much freedom as I had growing up because it was just a different world back then. But man, I would go, there was no cell phones. My brother and I would go taking off and riding our bikes across town and, up to the lake, go fishing in the summertime. And my dad would tell me, just make sure that you're home by sundown. That was the rules. He had no idea where we were. And I mean, like, I can't even imagine life like that today, but that's how it was. And I mean, I was like maybe 12, 13 years old, but it was a very different world. And those experiences definitely had an impact on my level of, I guess, adventure and lack of fear, versus today where you've got a lot of anxiety, I think, with the American youth, because, I don't think the world's any more dangerous. In fact, I think it's probably less dangerous, but because of the access to the internet and the news and the media, it seems like it's more dangerous,
Well, I certainly can remember playing a lot of ball in the streets, which kids don't do anymore. And
yeah. So, when you got into writing, what was the first book that you wrote, and how did that turn out?
Well, I actually I went to journalism school and graduated from college during the Vietnam War, and knew I had to do something about the draft. I enlisted in the reserves. I found a reserve unit. Eventually, actually wrote about it in a book I did about the history of basic training called Basic, with Colonel Jack Jacobs, a Medal of Honor winner. And my first job was I was a page at NBC, and Joan Rivers hired me
Oh, wow.
to write jokes for her TV show. And then I went and I did my basic at Fort Leonard Wood, came out, got a job at Time Incorporated, ended up as, at that time, the youngest reporter ever at Life magazine. And while I was there, every Sunday, I would look at the Times in the employment section under writer, to see if I could really make a living at it. And every week there were ads to write greeting cards for Hallmark. So I said, I can always do that. But one week there was an ad from a literary agent who had sold a children's book and needed somebody to write it. And I sent him a resume, and he called me, and eventually we became very close friends. And I married his niece.
Oh, nice.
So answering that ad made a big difference in my life.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that first book was a children's biography of Malcolm X.
Oh, wow.
And it was very successful. And then he had another client, and none of his more experienced writers were willing to risk this. This was a mafia hitman who went by the name of Joey Black, and he wanted to write his autobiography. So we wrote the first book with a mafia killer, called Killer. It's still in print these many, many years later. It was a huge bestseller. Joey and I ended up doing 4 books together before he was killed. And that got me started. That was the first bestseller.
Wow. That's awesome. Wow. Man, I'm going to have to go and pick up some of these. I really love nonfiction. That has always been, kind of the types of books that I like to read. And so right up my alley is the kind of stuff that you read or that you write. I've read a lot of autobiographies. I've read a lot of historical books and things like that. And I think the reason why I have preferred nonfiction is because I want to know what really happened. I want to know, the history and the things that people have experienced. I noticed that when I was in Japan, I lived there for 3 years. They love, autobiographies or biographical stories, and a lot of their movies that are big hits there are movies about people's lives. And that's just something that I think is really important. I do like my science fiction too, in terms of like movies and stuff. But if I'm going to take the time to read something, I want to know that what I'm reading is a real life event. And
Well, I'm like you. The only difference is I get to write them, not read them.
yeah,
And when I find a story that I think, why doesn't everybody know about this?
mhm.
Um, it just, I mean, at one point, I remember I was doing I wrote the companion books for Bill O'Reilly's Legends and Lies series. And at one point, while I was researching that, I found a note that there was a transcript for Abe Lincoln's last criminal trial, a murder trial.
Oh
And
wow.
as soon as I saw that, I said, well, why? I can't believe nobody's written
Nobody's
about it. I
written
can't
something
believe
about
I didn't know it. So I got a transcript. I found Dan Abrams,
it.
and because I felt I needed someone to work with who understood that world. And we did a book called Lincoln's Last Trial, which again was a very successful bestseller. And it's
Wow.
the same thing. This book, the one we're talking about tonight, this one, The Sailing of the Intrepid. If I tell you that the most modern, highly technological war weapon in history ended up requiring a sail to get home to Pearl Harbor, you'd say, well, you got to tell me that story,
Yeah.
because that doesn't, anyway. But what my point is, when I find a story, and I suspect you're the same way, I like to share it. I
Yeah.
like to research it. I can't wait to tell other people.
Yeah.
And,
Absolutely.
and this is one of them.
So tell us about the sailing of Intrepid. How did you come across this? What was the inspiration behind you writing this book?
I actually don't know where I first heard the story, but I have known about it for years. And all I knew was that at one point they hoisted a sail on the Intrepid. And it's kind of ruminated for years. And several years ago, I met Montel Williams, and he's a 22-year Navy and Marine vet. And, we said, wouldn't it be fun if we could find something to work on together? And I remembered this story. And he said, is that true? And we started investigating, and it turned out to be true. And it actually is quite an unusual, one of the more unusual stories you'll ever come across.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Tell us, for a lot of folks that may not know about this story, give us a little bit of background on it.
Well, we don't, as a nonfiction reader, I'm sure one of the things that makes a book, there are many things that make a book work. First of all, it has to be entertaining.
Yes.
If you're not entertained, you don't care. But I suspect the books that you like the most are the ones that cause you to say several times as you're reading it, wow, I didn't know that. That's really cool. Is that true? And so that's the way I approach a book. And with this book, first of all, the Intrepid itself has an incredible history. This is the fourth Intrepid. The first Intrepid was one of the great ships of early American history.
Mm-hmm.
It was a captured skiff, and it was captained by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur. And he used it to sneak into Tripoli Harbor during the Barbary Wars
Yeah.
and managed to get up next to the ship that had been the Philadelphia, which was America's largest warship that had been captured by pirates. And Stephen Decatur got his men aboard from the first Intrepid, and they burned it, and they escaped. And it was considered one of the great feats of warfare to that point. So the Intrepid has a great history. And when we started with this book, we started talking, it's not just about the Intrepid, but it's about the history of aircraft carriers, the history of flight, aviation, naval aviation. Again, one of those things, I didn't know that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A month before the Wright brothers flew, Professor Langley, that's where we get Langley.
Right. I drive by it many times.
Professor Langley was
Mm-hmm.
the head of the Smithsonian Institute,
Oh, wow.
and his passion was flight. And he wanted to be the first person, and he used the Smithsonian Institute to build an airplane. And they launched it from a houseboat in the Potomac River. And it actually flew 250, 230 feet. And because it was launched from a catapult as opposed from the ground, it wasn't considered powered flight, which he always resented. And they later displayed it at the Smithsonian as the first powered aircraft. So that we start with the history of flight and the fact that the greatest weapon on the seas was the battleship.
Mm-hmm.
And aircraft carriers, particularly after World War I, were considered much too vulnerable, much too expensive, and it had no real value. There was a group in the Navy, Billy Mitchell,
Mm-hmm.
who argued for naval aviation, and reluctantly, the United States started building aircraft carriers and had, I think, 7 by the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and they proved the value from that moment, from December 8th on. Aircraft carriers were the most important weapon in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this story, basically, in that it goes back to 1941, when Intrepid was still it had been approved by Congress and was being designed. That year, the greatest battleship was the Bismarck. And the Bismarck, after sinking the hood and killing 1,400 Royal Navy sailors, was hit by British torpedo planes, Swordfish, and the rudder got stuck at a 45-degree angle, rendering it unnavigable. And they tried to escape, but they couldn't. And because of that rudder, the British just pounded it and destroyed it, and it went down. Now, 4 years later, the Intrepid, on its first mission, after bombing, it was in the Marshall Islands, bombing of Truk Lagoon, it too was hit by a torpedo
Mm-hmm.
from a Japanese plane.
You're talking about, is that the Truk Islands?
Truk Lagoon. It was the big naval area.
Mm-hmm.
And just imagine this. It was the largest task force in history. And it was night, so they were sailing black, no lights.
Wow.
Intrepid was hit. They never found out how they believe that the Japanese plane saw its trail and followed it, launched, and its rudder got stuck at a 45-degree angle, just like Bismarck. So now, Intrepid, this 200,000 pound ton, 2,000, I'm going to get it wrong, very large behemoth of a ship is out of control in the middle of the largest task force in history, in the middle of the night, unable to see more than 100 yards in front of them, and going at 20 knots and incapable of steering. And all of a sudden, out of the night, there's the Essex. And it missed it by 100 yards or less, and just fate. That's all it was. And it somehow managed to sail out of the task force. And then it was left alone because it couldn't keep up and they couldn't steer. It was Intrepid and 2 battleships, 2 destroyers. And for 2 days, the captain was able to maintain some sort of control by shifting the engines and slaloming left and right, moving in the general direction of Pearl Harbor. And after 2 days, the winds shifted and they lost control. And as he said, we were corkscrewing and heading towards Tokyo. And at that moment, that was not where I wanted to go. So they came up with an ingenious solution. They rigged a sail. And what makes this fun, particularly for some of your audience, is Intrepid had a sailmaker.
Oh, wow.
And the sailmaker, it was an old rating that they just kept. And basically the sailmaker sewed canvas. His main job on a ship at that point was sewing body bags, but also hatch covers and things like that. The sailmaker on the Intrepid was a 26-year-old West Virginia boy from Calhoun County named Gordon Keith.
Wow.
And they went to him. The captain called him up to the bridge. He had never been on the bridge before. And the captain said, "We want you to make a sail." And he said, "I've never made a sail." And the concept of sewing a sail on an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, that's got to be crazy. I mean,
and
that's
he wasn't
huge ship compared to anything that has ever had a sail before.
This was, and the purpose of the sail was to blunt the wind. They didn't need it to power the ship. The engines were fine, but they needed to blunt the wind blowing from starboard because it was pushing them. And so the captain in his notes said it was a 3,000 square foot sail.
Wow.
It wasn't. It couldn't have been, but it was very large. And the whole ship gathered all the extra canvas they could find. They took hatch covers, they took lifeboat covers, anything they could find. And he sewed it with help from other people.
Wow.
And anyway, this is that story.
Well, that's incredible. And, I know a lot of people in Calhoun County, so I'm going to, a lot of people from West Virginia watch this show, so they're going to be very interested.
Well, his family, particularly a grandnephew named Lloyd Keith, who is still in that area, was immensely helpful, terrific, wonderful, friendly person. So say hello to Lloyd Keith for me. And
I will, definitely. Definitely. Wow. Now, aircraft carriers, my father my father-in-law was on an aircraft carrier during Vietnam. I think it was the Coral Sea or something like that. Yeah, I worked on an aircraft carrier, the GW, and what's interesting about the Navy, a lot of people don't understand unless you've worked in, like the kind of field I've worked in, where I've worked in cybersecurity for 27 years, but a good portion of my career was working for the Navy. And I got a chance to work in the Fleet Battle Lab in Yokosuka Naval Base. And so we had the GW, and we had all of the ballistic missile destroyers that were all on the base there. We had some subs, and we would run cables out to all of those ships so that we could push tracks for simulated war games. And it's a huge cost savings to the Navy because, I mean, they spend billions on fuel. So this was a way for them to be able to get more time in, in addition to the sea exercises that they do. But I've been on the GW, and it is just massive. It's a floating city. It is not like the other ships. It's funny. I've been on submarines too, and the sleeping quarters, in a submarine is tiny. It's like they call them hot racks because everybody's got to share beds. And very different though, on the aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier is almost luxury compared to these submarines. But to think that you could move, a ship or even blunt the wind for an aircraft carrier utilizing a sail, that is just crazy. I don't know how I never heard this story before.
Well, it is one of those stories, and it just reminds me. At some point I need to put you in touch with my collaborator, who is Montel Williams, whose Navy experience is very similar to yours. And he was a security, Montel's 22-year naval vet, Navy and Marines, served on aircraft carriers and submarines. He was the security officer, the cybersecurity officer on submarines. That was his area. That was his MOS. That was his area.
No idea.
Yeah. Well, that's the
That's
two
amazing.
of you. The
We
two
would
of you
definitely have some great
probably,
conversations.
you may well have crossed paths at some point, and his experience was invaluable, because one of the things we talked about in doing this was, and we do go into life on an aircraft carrier to some degree. And the thing that struck me more than anything is learning that there were times people would not be on deck or see the day or the night for 2, 3, 4 days at a time. They were below deck. And I kept thinking, when kamikazes in particular were diving on this ship, on any ship, and you're below deck and you have no idea what's going on. And Intrepid was hit by more kamikazes than any aircraft carrier that survived.
Wow.
And that concept, we try, an important part of nonfiction is conveying or communicating a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So your reader can feel the emotion. And what we've tried to do in this book is convey the feeling of what it's like being 3 decks below during combat. And there is nothing you can do about it except pray.
Yeah.
And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. We go through the whole night that Intrepid was hit by the torpedo, and 11 sailors were killed. And one of the things that the U.S. Navy had taken very seriously after World War I was damage control. because what happened is the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had proved during World War One that damage control saved ships.
Mm-hmm.
And we took lessons from the German Navy about designing ships, building compartments, being able to close compartments,
Yep.
having firefighting equipment, and water
Oh, yeah.
hoses, literally every 100 feet. And you know, I mean, and I love.
And they train on these ships. I've been there many times. You know, walking onto ships, doing, you know, usually bringing cable on or doing some cybersecurity work, and all the time, I would almost, you know, I would say at least probably half of the times I was on a ship, they were doing some sort of, putting out fires type of training going on, because that's, you know, you get a fire on a ship, and that you have to put it out. And it's just, there's nothing you can do but put it out, because you're not gonna be able to escape from it. So
Well, I mean, it's so, and we go into all this kind of
yeah,
all this stuff that before going into battle, before on a mission, on the way to the Marshall Islands, for example, they chip paint off because paint, if it burns, emits fumes, and fumes can be toxic. And one of the lessons that they learned very early is copper wire melted. So, and if there was a fire and you were trying to get from one place to another, and the wire was melting, you couldn't do it. And so damage control, again, which we go into in some fascinating detail, was key to saving the ship.
yeah. Wow. No, that's interesting. Now I'm curious. Who would you say, you know, in terms of your greatest influences, who would be your greatest influence on your type of writing?
You know, I wanted to be a sports writer. I think that was the way I started. And then, to be honest, one of my first assignments at Life magazine was spending 2 weeks on the road with the Atlanta Hawks basketball team.
Oh,
And
wow.
after that, I said, if I have to do this for the rest of my life, it just was not something that made me happy. And so, in terms of an influence, I read all of the storytellers, you know, and you read Upton Sinclair writing about the meat markets, and you read early journalism. You know, right now there is, I think, the best site on the internet is called newspaper.com. And
I know it.
newspaper.com
Yeah.
has access to 1,000 newspapers. And I did a book. The last book I did before this one was called America's Deadliest Election, that I did with CNN's Dana Bash. And it was about the 1872, sounds silly, 1872 gubernatorial election in Louisiana that changed America for 100 years. And it was the election that led to the Jim Crow laws. It was the election that led to the presidential election in 1876 of Rutherford B. Hayes and the withdrawal of the federal troops from the South. But I read the newspapers every day, the Louisiana newspapers. And so if you want to have fun, that there is no site on the internet that's more fun than to be able to go anywhere in American history and read the newspapers of the time.
What there was a pizza place near our old house in Maryland, and they had old newspapers that were like framed, on the walls. And I mean, these were like old newspapers going back to 1800s and that sort of thing. And it was interesting because there was a lot of gossip in these newspapers. Like people would be talking about who got married and, oh, this person, ran off with this person. And I mean, it was just fascinating to me. If there was any kind of news at all that was like interesting, the two Siamese twin sisters, were at some event somewhere, and it was just it's kind of an interesting thing to see these times in American history. You don't see that kind of stuff in the papers today necessarily, but back then they had a lot of interesting things in the paper.
Well, it was, one of the things about this book is in talking about the history of aviation, as we do, I was able to go back to the newspaper stories about the Wright brothers' flight. And you talk about gossip and asides. Nobody really, it was not a big deal. It was, if it was on page one, it was not the big story. And after the Wright brothers flew, they only had two offers. The government offered them $5,000 to build a Wright flyer for experimental purposes. And the owner of Luna Park, Coney Island, offered them $10,000 to make their next flight over Coney Island.
Oh, wow.
So, and that's from the newspapers. You're not going to find, that's the kind of stuff that's in the book.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. I'm definitely, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So how do you approach writing historical fiction versus nonfiction? Like what are some of the challenges? I mean, you mentioned one, obviously you got to find out about these little pieces of history that nobody else knows about or that nobody's, written about before. So you mentioned one, but what are some of the other things that you do?
Well, research. I did a book that is in print now 30 years later called The War Magician. And there was one paragraph in a book that Ladislas Farrago wrote called Game of the Foxes about spies in World War II. And it talked about a British magician named Jasper Maskelyne who used the techniques of stage magic against the Germans and eventually convinced Rommel at Alamein that the entire British army was in the north when in fact it was in the south. Great story. One paragraph in the book. I spent 2 years researching it.
Wow.
I went to the library because the internet did not exist, and I read the Egyptian Daily Mail every day for 2 years. So I immersed myself. And it was funny. I had one night I was having dinner with 3 other writers. And I was deeply involved in Egypt in 1939, 1940. And I was with Bill Smith, who was writing Gorky Park at the time.
Oh, wow.
And he was immersed in Russian military. And somebody else was writing, a guy named John Pekkanen was writing about organ transplants, about how one person had died and for the first time had given multiple organs. So he was totally immersed in the medical world. And it was sort of fun bouncing off each other because that was our daily life. So I think what happens is you start researching a subject and you find stuff and you think, hey, that's cool. I mean, Luna Park, I got to get that in there. People are going to love that. And you kind of get as much of that as you possibly can. And then sometimes you have to make some suppositions.
Sure.
In this book, it was surprisingly little actually written about the sale. So it required piecing lots of stuff together. And sometimes we had to recreate conversations. And there's no question that some version of this conversation took place.
Sure.
And Montel was terrific with this, because I would say,
or he would know the language, the lingo, right?
it's the language,
Yeah.
you'll feel familiar with it. So you have to understand the background, even if you're going to create events and characters and things like that. And because there are always going to be people who are going to nitpick and find things and say, that's not right, and so you can't write defensively.
Sure.
One of the things that I always tell writers who ask me, how do you write a book? And the answer is, you write a book. And I always think of it as magazine chapters, 10 magazine chapters, 12 magazine chapters.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is the recognition is it's never going to be as good as you think it should be.
Sure.
You are never going to reach the level that you think you should be, ever, because it doesn't exist. So what happens with too many writers is young writers is they spend forever rewriting chapter 1.
Mm.
And what I always tell people is never, ever go back until you're done. Because if you go back, you'll never reach the end.
That is true. So I just finished my first book.
Congratulations.
And it is about my whistleblowing experience, which is a pretty scary story at times. And I think it's going to be a page turner, but it is the challenge of what you're talking about. That is exactly, I wrote the first chapter, and my wife was kind of helping me along and typing for me as I was going, and she'd want to stop and be like, wait, we got to fix this. I'm like, nope, we got to move on. And then we'll come back later and fix it, because otherwise I know who I am and I just will not finish it. It was tough. It was, especially, I think, because I was writing my own story, there's a lot of reliving, some of the trauma that we experienced. And so I would write a chapter, and then I'd need to take a nap, and I wouldn't want to do anything for a couple of days just to kind of, get back to, normal feeling. But the challenge is so now I've written the thing. Now I'm going back and going through it, and I'm realizing, okay, I go back and forth in time. So the first chapter is about my first day that I decided to blow the whistle. Then I go back to my childhood and what made me who I am, and why I am wired the way I am to have to blow the whistle and not be able to just turn a blind eye. And so I tell a lot of stories from my youth, but that transition between those chapters, that was tough, having to figure out how to transition that and then transition back. So it just didn't seem like, where are we? And, but I think, I'll tell you, I'm grateful today that I'm writing a book today versus if I had to write it 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, because I was able to run it through some grammar, tools, and it caught a lot of my mistakes that I would have otherwise would have missed. But it's challenging, and the thing that I found is I would have written the book sooner, but for one, not having ever written a book before, it was hard to find any kind of publisher or anybody to help me with this. I finally just said, forget it. I'm just going to write it.
Yeah.
And then when I'm done, I'll, do what I got to do, self-publish or whatever. Because for me, it's not even about writing a bestseller, I just wanted to get something written down for history's sake, for my kids, my grandkids, because it's pretty, it's pretty important events that took place in my life. I think about somebody like yourself, and when you're writing somebody else's story, you have to get creative. It's not just about, you got to fill in a lot of gaps, right? And
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about a book that my wife and I read a few years back. It was Chesapeake by James Michener. And it was fascinating because we were reading this book. We decided to read this book because we were going to take a trip to Chesapeake. And it was amazing how many things, like, he doesn't say in his book. Like, he talks about these different Indian tribes, right? But then we
Right.
would go down and we would turn down a street and it was named after that tribe that I would have never known that had I not read that book. We stop at this, this restaurant and, and had a dish that's talked about in this book. It was just kind of interesting, like these little facts that, that he picked out that he talks about. And that's
Well,
the kind of stuff that to me is fascinating, that kind of history.
I'll give you a
Even,
good example. Chesapeake being fiction,
Mhm.
and I wrote a novel in which my main character is in a wheelchair, and my wife and I have a close friend who is in a wheelchair, and he said something to me once that I never forgot. He said, "When you want to get a glass of water, you go, grab a glass, and you get a glass of water. When I want to get a glass of water, I have to think, can I reach the glass? If I get the glass, can I reach, and how do I turn the faucet on? Where do I put the glass? How do I turn it off? Where do I get?" And he went through the entire process for me, which I had never, ever
Yeah.
thought about. And so in this book, putting my character in a wheelchair meant bringing the reader into that world
Right.
that I never think about. For example, my character's apartment was searched. I'm sure you recognize that.
Oh, I know that.
And
That
and
that is
yeah,
such a violating feeling.
and
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 there are things, you're right. There are things that nobody would ever think about that happen.
and they wanted to do. They did not want him to know it was searched, but he said, in his mind, as I wrote, that because he was in a wheelchair, he had to locate the furniture around his desk at a certain distance
Mhm.
to get to the back of the desk. And so when he started going to the back of the desk, the chair had been moved. And that was how he knew that was one of them. Because he couldn't get enough leverage to open the bottom drawer of his desk, he always left it just partially open. It was closed. So it's exactly what you say. You have to know what the environment is.
Yeah.
You have to know what Chesapeake was like, what those Indian tribes were like, to make it read real. So,
Right. Yeah. And there's, the other thing too, that I found a real interest in is these books that tell the story of how industries started, or like how, I was reminded of it when you were talking about your friend that was talking about organ transplants. And I read a book called The Devil, or is the Devil or the Demon Under the Microscope? And it was talking about the discovery of bacteria and antibiotics. And that came about after World War One, when they had all these guys dying from gangrene. And so they discovered about the sulfa drugs. And so it's a story about something you would think would be boring, because it's a lot, but it's not. It's so interesting and so fascinating. When the way that, and I can't remember the author of that book, but it was a very interesting story about how modern medicine, came about that changed the world. And it's largely, a lot of, Germans actually that worked on that.
Well, I love that stuff, and I've written about medicine several
Mhm.
times. And I did a book called Patient Number One, which was about the creation of a medical device, a stem cell separation device.
Oh, wow.
When you get a transplant, they take all your white blood cells out and uh, clean them and hopefully get rid of all the cancer cells and then put them back in. And in that book, I had to research, I wanted to know the whole history of transplants. And it's fascinating. Do you know where the whole concept of transplants started?
No.
The bombing of Hiroshima.
Oh, wow.
What happened was 6 months after the bombing of Hiroshima, people started dying.
Mm.
Nobody knew why. And when they did autopsies, they saw they had no white blood cells.
Oh, wow.
And so the whole concept began, and of transplanting new cells into people, taking cells out, and it didn't work because it would work for a brief period of time, and then people would develop something called graft versus host disease, which would kill them. And then twins had an organ transplant, and it worked.
Ah,
And that was the
interesting.
beginning of transplants. That's when they began to understand.
That may have also been the beginning. I wonder if that inspired them to start researching about DNA as well.
I'll tell you something interesting I've just discovered.
Okay.
I'm just finished working on a book with Bob Redfield, who was the head of the CDC during COVID.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of research, and I was stunned to find out. Do you know who was the co-inventor of the first flu vaccine?
No? Who's that?
Jonas Salk.
Oh, wow.
And during World War, as many as 75,000 American soldiers were either killed or taken out of World War I by the Spanish flu. So as we started moving into World War II, the military had a massive campaign to try and find a vaccine for influenza. And Salk was working with a much older guy. And I think it was the University of Maryland. I'm not sure. Maybe Johns Hopkins. And they came up with this vaccine, and it worked for the flu. It, again, like the COVID vaccine, it did not prevent you from getting it, but it made it a much milder disease, and it didn't kill you. And Salk took all the knowledge he had gained from that to create the polio vaccine.
Oh, wow.
But it was really cool finding out, what a genius he was.
Yeah. Yeah. There's I got a comment in here in the chat, and I want to bring this up because I read this book, and but Troll said you should read the book called The K, where a black Jamaican man saves a little white boy on an island during a hurricane. I had to read that book when I was in school, and I love that book. It was one of to me, that was actually one of the first books that kind of took me into that cross-cultural experience of seeing, something that I never saw in my lifetime, about these differences between race. It's funny, there was a lot less problems with race for me growing up than it seems like there has been in the last 5 years or 10 years. And but it was interesting to go back and to see that and see that history, um and kind of live through that experience on this island, right, and the hurricane and all of that. That was kind of my first book I ever read that had
Really?
that kind of experience, and it really did. From that, I actually ended up reading some other books that were, I can't remember the name of it, but was it Dolphin Island? It's about a Native American girl on an island that was left by her tribe, and she stays on this island surviving. But it was just fascinating,
Hmm.
and but I love those types of stories. And one of the stories that I was thinking about, and I got a question that kind of follows it. When I was in Japan, they had a bookstore in the mall that had some Japanese books that had been translated to English. And one of them that I read that had a profound impact on me was called The Bells of Nagasaki. And it was a Japanese book translated in English, but was written by a man who survived the bombing, the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki. And he was a doctor. And he watched his own, couple of his colleagues, like a nurse that he worked with, was like vaporized, and just the shadow basically of her on the concrete wall. But because he was behind the concrete, he survived it. But he talks about how he went around and basically taking care of people that were further away from where the bomb hit, but were still affected by radiation poisoning. And you learn some interesting things in history. Like one of the things that they didn't have really any way of treating it, but he found the most effective way was to give them the best whatever sake of their choice and have them drink it daily. And I don't know why or what benefit that was. Maybe it was just so that they could not suffer so much, but a lot of the people did recover, and which was really interesting. And what was fascinating about the book was there's history there that I would have never known. For example, the largest Christian community in all of Japan was in Nagasaki. And in fact, where the bomb dropped and exploded was right above the oldest Christian church in all of Japan, right in the center of town, the Nagasaki. And he was a Christian. And so he's writing this from a Christian perspective, but as a Japanese Christian during World War II. And so what a different way of seeing things and understanding, than, it's so unique as it is. I think Japan has like less than 1% Christian. But he said something very interesting in the end of his book, and I thought it was very profound. He said that he felt like it was appropriate for Nagasaki, because the bomb was not supposed to hit Nagasaki. It was supposed to hit like further, I think, northeast of there, where they had like factories, but the winds shifted it over the city of Nagasaki that was, population center. And he said how appropriate that, that the bomb to end the war, was over Nagasaki. He said the largest Christian community, he says, where he felt like they became the sacrificial lamb, just like Jesus Christ. And it was very moving. It brought me to tears, reading this book. But I'm curious, have any of your books been translated into other languages and read by people in other countries?
Many, many, many. I did a book, a short little book, for example, called Conversations with My Cat.
That would be great.
I am a
I
cat
love it already.
And for example, in this book, my cat is now telling me We're having a conversation, and he's telling me everything about being a cat. And he says the first thing that any kitten learns is how to deal with human beings. And the basic philosophy governing all relationships between cats and human beings can be summed up as you scratch my back, you scratch my back.
Oh, that is so true.
There's a reason that cats say meow, not weow. And
Yes.
so, and anyway, so that book
That's so hilarious.
sold very few copies here. It was a #1 bestseller in France. It won all kinds of awards. It was a #1 bestseller in Israel.
Oh,
Won
that's funny.
awards. And I've had
So you learn something about culture too, you know, by
Well,
seeing
I-
what books are bestsellers in other countries.
I just got a copy of a book in Polish, and I didn't even know what book it was till I had to, So yes, I've been published probably
That's
in
awesome.
30 languages.
You know,
at
funny
least.
story about cats, because now I've got to tell you this. So my cat, I've got I don't know, it was a black barn cat that we got, and he's a house cat, but he has a name, but he only knows Kitty, because that's what he's been called like pretty much his whole life. And but he loves to sit in the prominent chair. Like if we're sitting in the living room watching TV, he'll sit in like the easy chair, and he sits like a human. He'll just like kind of lean back, and it's the weirdest thing. And then if we're sitting at the table, the dining room table, eating dinner, he'll get up on the table and try to sit at the table to be like one of us. And my father-in-law, whenever he's sitting in the chair, he calls him Chairman Meow. But it is so hilarious. I love animals. And
You will love this book.
I'm gonna have to get that. I'll get that for my wife, because she'll love that.
So,
That's great.
but
Now,
so your question about other languages is,
that's great. The thing about that to me is really, it's a special thing to think about. Is when somebody in another country gets to read a story about an American's experience, it gives them an insight into our world and our worldview. And likewise, when we read something that somebody has written in another country that's been translated into English, it does that same experience for us. I think that's one of the best things that can happen, for mankind, is for us to be able to read each other's stories and understand, what goes on in the mind. I had this fascinating experience living in other countries where, and I really experienced this strongly in Japan. I had a lot of Japanese friends. We lived off base, and I joined a local windsurfing club so I could get to know the locals, and because we lived down by Mirakaigon Beach, and sitting around, just fellowshipping and talking with them. One day, it's funny because they celebrate Christmas, even though they're not Christian. They celebrate, Halloween. I went to a Halloween parade up in Kawasaki. They will have Christian weddings and Buddhist funerals, and then they have their Shinto celebrations, and it's really interesting. And if you ask the average Japanese if they're religious or if they have a religion, and they'll tell you they don't have a religion, but yet they still participate in all of these different types of events. And I realized that what I perceived of how the Japanese mind worked was totally wrong. And so in sitting and talking with them, I asked them, I said, what do you think is the biggest difference between the way that Japanese people think and the way that Americans think? And I was very intrigued by one of the answers. And one of my friends told me, he says, Americans are very opinionated. and I was like, I was taken aback by that. But then I thought about it. Every time I ever asked anybody in Japan for directions, they went, they didn't want to give you directions because they didn't want to give their opinion and be wrong. And if you asked them their opinion on politics, they didn't want to get into that. they really were a lot less opinionated, and they had this saying.
You know, you use the word opinion, and I did a book with Carrie Mullis. Carrie won the Nobel Prize for inventing the polymerase chain reaction,
Oh wow.
which which was the beginning of the DNA revolution.
Yeah.
Changed the world. Carrie changed the world with this. And we were talking about the same thing. And he was talking about teaching and lecturing in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him the difference. And he said, those kids are really smart. And if you give them an assignment, they will go home and they will memorize every word and they will be able to give it back to you. But if you ask them to be creative, they can't.
Well,
That's not the way their mind works. Now this was a while
No,
ago.
you're absolutely right. And in fact, on that note, on the creativity thing, I mean, they're famous for their haiku, right? Which is a very short, simplistic, poetry. When you look at their art, in particular, one of the famous things that they do there is their artwork with flower arrangement, and it's very simplistic. In fact, the more simple, the more beautiful to them.
Less
More
is more.
complicated. They don't do like big bouquets like we do. That to them is kind of ugly. Like they want a more simplistic, delicate, features to it. But this opinion thing was kind of interesting because they had this saying that I was always hearing the Japanese saying. And they say shogunai ne, and it means it can't be helped. So I'm not going to worry about it. It's funny because occasionally I'd hear my Japanese friends say that to their wives, and their wives, don't you shogunai me, so because they would get home late or something, out drinking with their friends. But
well, I'm going to come full circle.
Okay.
Because there's nothing more creative than the ingenious solution that they came up with to save this ship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
well, that's a good bow on this conversation.
yeah.
And I am excited. Looking forward to actually getting a copy of it and reading it. Where can people get your book? I mean, obviously there's the Amazon of the world, but is there another place where people can get your book?
It's really on every internet site at this point. Everybody's carrying it. Some stores are carrying it. Every local bookstore, it's just pub date is not till is still a week or so away, so it's not available in physical stores yet, but it will be. Makes a great Father's Day present.
Oh yeah, my father-in-law, he's absolutely. I already know what I'm getting for him. Absolutely, because he was a sailor.
That's one sale.
Yeah.
So, Nate, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
This has been delightful.
Yeah, and hang on after the show's over because I'd love to just ask you a couple questions off there.
Sure, I'd be delighted.
And but this has been a great conversation, and I really look forward to checking out your book, and I want to get some of your other ones too, especially the cat one. I definitely got to get that. But thank you so much for coming on. Last question that I want to ask you, and actually two more questions I want to ask you. First one is, what advice would you give to aspiring writers who are just starting out?
Write about what entertains you, because if you're not having a good time doing it, your reader is not going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
The second thing is, which is, I guess, a little strange, is don't romanticize what you're doing. It's a job. Being a writer is a job.
Yeah.
And you have to go to work every day, literally every day. You have to work a full day, and you have to treat it like a job.
Yeah.
Not, you know, if you begin to think you're creating art, you've lost.
Right.
You've lost.
Yeah.
You're a storyteller. An author is a storyteller, and the idea is to tell the story in a way that will entertain, enlighten, and educate your reader. Um, so that's and do it. Just do it.
Do it.
I don't, you know,
The old
I
Nike
get up in the
adage.
morning. I get up in the morning and I say, this is what I'm going to get done, and
Mhm.
that's what I get done every
Yeah.
day. And there's no such thing as I can't write today. You do it. It's a job, and you have to work at it like any other job.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good advice. So I always ask my guests, we talked about a lot of things, but what is the one thing that you want people to take away from this conversation more than anything?
Well, I mean, in this case, I would like them to think, you know, I got to read that book. That
Absolutely.
sounds like a lot of fun. And when you have me on next time, I'll say about whatever book we're talking about. I got to read that book. That's you know, you want to. A book is an entertainment form, just like a movie, just like a television show. Um, it can be expensive. I mean, if you buy it online, it's a lot less expensive. So you better get several hours, a lot of hours of
Yeah.
entertainment out of it. And you know, so that's I would remind people that reading still is one of the great entertainment forms, and it allows you access to your own mind.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, sitting in front of a television is a passive exercise.
Yeah.
Reading is an active exercise, mental exercise.
Yeah, because your mind has to create all of the
You have to see it. You have
visualizations
to
of
see
everything.
what's
That's
happening.
right.
You have
Yeah.
to be on
Direct.
that aircraft carrier
Yeah.
and be in that room when they're sewing the sail.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm doing some of that right now with my book is going back and looking for what are areas where I need to like add more context and you know the surroundings and the characteristics of the people that I was talking to and dealing with and that's partly what I'm doing in the editing process as well. So but yeah, I know exactly what you're saying because yeah, it's got to be you got to be able to visualize it because otherwise somebody else isn't going to be able to do that. So yeah, well, thank you so much, David, for coming on the show. And I always like to close my show in prayer, and I'm going to do that now. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for David and for his sacrifice of time to write this story and capture these pieces of history for the world. I pray that you would bless his book and this endeavor, Lord, that it would be a great hit, it would be a great seller, and that you would bring people into uh, the lives of many of these men that have sacrificed so much for our country, Lord. And I just thank you for great storytellers of the world to be able to capture those stories and share them with us all. I pray your blessing on his future endeavors and that you would continue to help him to be a prolific writer and a great author. I ask this in Jesus' name, amen. David, thank you again. And if people want to follow you on social media, are you on social media?
I'm actually not. I need to rectify that.
Okay.
Uh,
Maybe I can help you with that.
yeah, I'm starting to be on Instagram and a couple of others now, but
Yeah.
it's not been a priority. So
Do you have a
I
website?
know.
Do you have
So
a website?
I don't.
Okay.
There is one, but it's not very active.
Okay.
You know, it's David Fisher, and it lists all my books. But you can go to Amazon, and it has them all.
All right.
But thank you.
Well, I am definitely looking forward to reading your books. And again, hang on after the show, and
Yep.
I'll talk with you a little bit about that, and maybe I can help you in that direction. So,
Okay.
folks, thank you so much for joining the show today. We had 1,800 people live listening, and it's just been a great audience. Folks, make sure and check out his book, and hold that up one more time for folks so they can see it. There you go. Sailing of the Intrepid, Montel Williams and David Fisher. Looking forward to seeing that. It's going to be an awesome book. This will be a great Father's Day gift. Absolutely. I don't know a man in the world who wouldn't want to read a book like this. These types of stories, I think, are the kind of things that really do capture men's hearts. Folks, remember to check out his books, and also remember to like and subscribe to this show. If you like this kind of content, we're going to be, having additional authors on. I love to try to do at least one author a month, because I just think there's so many great books out there. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us, and sharing a little bit about your passion and your history and some of the stories. I think those are great.
Well, thank
With
you for
that, folks, have a wonderful night. God bless, and God bless America.
Raise some Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. In the heartland where the faith runs strong, we've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless, day and night, we'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call, watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change, time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.